It's great to see you on this eighth evening with the Sermon on the Mount, and I want to begin with a perpetual problem in homiletics because I have seen a lot of sermons in my life. I've graded some back in the day. I have heard a whole lot of them in a whole lot of different churches, and one of the most difficult things in preaching is to finish well. I know so many sermons where they have their stock 3 points and they're done well. They've opened with some kind of pizzazz, but they ran out of time or they ran out of creativity, and they did one of two things. And I'll share my screen to illustrate those two options. So you're seeing the two possibilities here that I see most. One is circle the runway and never quite get to the point where you land. Some people preach four conclusions on accident. They don't mean to. They just keep going. I have a good friend who was a colleague with me for a while, Thomas Daniel, whose wife is also a clergy person. And Thomas preaches beautifully. His wife, Beth, is very sensitive to the fact that sometimes he just keeps rolling out conclusions. And so she stands in the back and she will go, if you can see my hand on your screen, she will go like this. She'll go in order to say, would you please land the plane? And that's one of the things that happens, right? People extend beyond the power of the conclusion into people starting to cough or otherwise indicate that they're ready to go home. The second error, of course, is to land too quickly. And this crash bombing Air France airplane, it's just a simulation. This isn't the actual. But this crash landing is like other sermons that I hear, and they've used all of their energy, and so they just say the end or something that sounds a little bit like the end. We are coming right now to the end of our Sermon on the Mount, and we call it a sermon. Matthew doesn't call it a sermon. The word sermon doesn't appear, but we have seen that it has a powerful beginning in the Beatitudes. I wrote in my prep guide that an ancient fixture in rhetoric and oratory was to do what the Latin term captatio benevolentiae captures, which is to capture the benevolence of, to grab the goodwill of your audience. Well, in our case, Jesus opened with the Beatitudes, which said, against all odds, the people I am talking to, these peasants and fishermen and other day laborers, you are blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, and on in what we'll end with today was captured very well by Barbara Brown Taylor in a quote we started with, which is to say, it turns things upside down and welcomes people who clearly in any statistical study are not the people who live on a hill or have the mansion or anything like that. They are, against all odds, the blessed. That's how Jesus began this sermon powerfully, and he had them on board with the first 16 verses, right? He ends today with the famous parable of the two house builders. And we're going to grab that parable by looking at a visual that was a part of my early experience in life. When I was growing up, my family went in with another family and bought a beach house very near this, which is called the Salishan Spit. It's in Lincoln City, Oregon, or just outside it. And this structure happened over time, but it was fortuitous for people, or so they thought, who wanted to build big houses, and they would have water on both sides. And they got all excited and they started building these big houses. And when I was a kid, the big scandal of it all was those houses were sinking into the ocean. The erosion had caused these multi-million-dollar houses to kind of wash their way into the surf. And so I was a part of a Bible study when I was senior in high school, and we brought probably 25 people to our little beach house. This is our little beach house. Do you see how tiny it is? How humble it is? It's a tiny little place. Try getting 20 people in there. It was really a good effort. And we went out and we read this parable as a part of what we were doing. It wasn't planned this way, but we read it. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it didn't fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So we saw this parable playing out in our real life in Lincoln City, Oregon. But it would be easy to get so focused on the houses that we miss the focus of Jesus. Let's take a look again. It's almost like you can get so interested in the house built on the rock and the house built on the sand that you can miss what he is wrapping up his sermon with, which is the people who hear these words of mine and act on them will be the rock people. And the people who hear these words of mine and don't act on them will be like the sand builder, right? We at various times in the process of going through this sermon have noticed together and remembered together my friend David Bartlett, who as a young preacher at the University of Chicago Divinity School would stand outside after his 57th grace sermon and hold his Bible and wait for people to come and shake their hands, and they all felt great because it was a grace sermon. But you remember one of his favorite theology professors came out one day and grabbed his Bible and noticed that only Paul's letters had been dirtied up, and asked him, could we please get some Matthew and James, right? This is why that professor did this, because at the end of this gorgeous sermon, at the end of this world-changing sermon, Jesus says, if you do these things, you're like the rock guy. If you don't do them, it doesn't matter how many times you hear them, you're like the sand guy. The focus on deeds, the focus on actually embodying what Jesus is teaching is profound here. And it suits the sermon as a whole. So tonight, we're going to be able not only to hold this last section, it's very brief, not only to hold this last section together and drill down on it, but see how it properly closes what we've seen week to week for the first 7 weeks, how it properly brings home the picture of a life lived that Jesus has put before us. Because a life lived requires doing the things that he said. So let's drill a little deeper on this and look at a few parallels from prior days that may be in the back of Jesus's head when he speaks these words. In Proverbs 12:7 and 14:11, King Solomon says, the wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. That's 14:11. The house of the wicked is destroyed, but the tent of the upright flourishes. That's 12:7. I think they're backwards here. But you can see that this standing of the righteous house and this the destruction of the wicked person's house may be in the background for Jesus as he speaks this. In Deuteronomy 28, there's a little less resonance, but I want to read it because it has a bit of a parallel, and we've seen that Deuteronomy has mattered in the antitheses. So let's take a look at Deuteronomy 28, where Jesus says, But if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees that I'm commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall you be in your Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. And then after many, many that sound like that, you shall build a house and not live in it. Tiny little resonance. But since we saw last week the two ways that Jesus offered, broad is the way of destruction, but narrow is the gate that leads to life. We had Deuteronomy on our mind, and Jesus may have had, and Matthew, who collected Jesus, may have had Deuteronomy on his mind, and this may be in the background. So there are biblical allusions that are available. There's also this rabbinic quote, and it's probably from later than Jesus spoke or Matthew wrote. It's in a collection of midrash that were collected over the course of the 400s through the 800s. But the thing about rabbinic writings or rabbinic sayings is that it's a cumulative gathering, and it's not too concerned. If you ever use rabbinic writings, they're just fascinating and they're wonderful. There's not a concern for putting them in order of when they were spoken. So we can go backwards and say, when did this rabbi live, or when did that? It's kind of hard to place which ones happened in Jesus's time, or before Jesus' time, or after Jesus's time. This one seems later, but let's read it because it will sound familiar. One in whom there are good works, who has studied much Torah, to what may he be likened? To a person who builds first with stones and afterward with bricks. Even when much water comes and collects by their side, it does not dislodge them. But one in whom there are no good works, though he studied Torah, to what may he be likened? To a person who builds first with bricks and afterward with stones. Even when a little water gathers, it overturns them immediately. This is Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, and it's quoted in Avot Rabbi Natan, and it sounds parallel to Jesus's words. There may have been a saying going in the time that Jesus spoke that was parallel to this. We aren't sure. But I want you to notice the difference, because what is the focus in each of them? The focus is doing what's been spoken, right? You see this. One in whom there are good works, who has studied much Torah, to what may he be likened? So the good works are featured. They're the differentiating feature here, right? Because the second one is, this one studied Torah too, but no good works, right? This seems to be parallel to Jesus's emphasis, but what is the thing being obeyed? In this case, Torah, right? The one who studies and does what Torah says is like the guy who builds bricks, rock first and then bricks, right? And the house stands. But notice, the audacity of Jesus is to say, we'll go back. Whoops. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And anybody who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man. Notice that it's not Torah that Jesus is saying, even though he has dealt with Torah in the sermon. He says, these words of mine are the thing to obey, are the thing to do, the thing to act on, right? That, in the context of rabbis, that would have been perceived as extremely audacious and somewhat heretical. Do you get it? Because he's not drawing attention. He says, I'm going to fulfill Moses and the prophets in other places in the sermon, as you remember. But here he says, these words of mine are the rock on which you can build a life. Rabbis didn't say those kinds of things. They were always Torah referential. And that's a good thing, right? But notice the distinctive. Jesus is saying, you can trust my words to be the thing you build your life on, right? That's an important thing to notice as we look at these parallels. We don't do it just for fun. There's reason and distinction between the way Jesus did things and the way the rabbis did. It's no wonder that people took to looking at him differently and tried to suss out who he is in the chapters after we finish chapter 7. People start to ask, who is this guy? And why does he have this authority? Who is this guy? And why can he do these things? Even in the sermon, he's setting himself apart. It doesn't look like rabbinic teaching in this moment, right? So we can understand why there would have been a bit of a fracas between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. He's doing a different thing. He's set up a different stand at the fair. All right, so now if we get these parallels and if we realize the distinctives of them, I also want to notice how this section ends, because the very last words of chapter 7 are a reflection on the response, not a continuation of Jesus's words. And so I want to take a look at Mark 1, which the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the narrator's comments at the Sermon on the Mount parallel Mark 1:21, where Jesus and the disciples, at that point, Jesus, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, not all the disciples, just the 4 who came from their nets. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Notice where this is located. In the synagogue in Capernaum, which is where Jesus did a lot of his teaching, right? In Capernaum and on the beach and in Capernaum. Now, after this, in Mark, Jesus immediately casts out the demon of a man who comes into the synagogue while he's teaching, right? And so the behavior, kind of the story takes over in Mark 1. But the parallel comment about how the people responded to Jesus's teaching precedes that. So we should picture Jesus having gone in the synagogue, taught for a while, and everybody goes, whoa, this is different than we usually hear, right? But now look where it appears, of course, in Matthew. We aren't in a synagogue at all. It's open air preaching, right? It's out on the hillside. We talked earlier about how it gets called a mount because of Sinai and Carmel and other mountains in the tradition, but it's a hill, right? He's up on a hillside, and this is a kind of a more recent and not classical. I've used a lot of classical and international art through this. This is a more recent one, but I like the way it captures the moment. When Jesus had finished saying these words, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. It's practically a direct quotation of Mark. We've talked before about how most scholars believe that Mark wrote first and then Matthew and Luke used Mark, and the rest is kind of sussing out how they did that. Here we've got almost direct quotation about how people responded, but Matthew places it on the hillside. It first appears for Mark when people are astonished at his teaching in the synagogue. And I bring it here because I want to notice that this, and we'll come back to it in a little bit, but the sermon has lasted from verse 3 of chapter 5, where the Beatitudes began, to verse 27 of chapter 7, where the house on the sand ends, right? It's been speech from there, all Jesus's talk from there, from 5:3 to 7:27. On each end, we've got a narrator both opening and closing to frame it, right? The opening was Jesus walked up on the hillside, went up the mountain, and his disciples followed him. And when he sat down, they gathered and listened, right? I want you to notice that was the opening. Who is in awe here? When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were astounded. He's quoted Mark, right? But we've pictured all along, we've taken little check-ins during these 8 weeks and said, the disciples were the only audience at first. But this gathered crowd that would have followed Jesus around, and that we know from later episodes followed him even when he didn't want anybody to come, when he'd go away to get peace, and they'd follow him across the Sea of Galilee. Here, a crowd has gathered by the end to co-admire Jesus' sermon, to be astonished along with the disciples at this teaching, because it looks different than what their scribes do, right? So it's worth seeing that there are 2 verses on the front, 2 verses on the back that become the frame for the Sermon on the Mount, right? One that sends them up the hill, the other that gives the response at the end. We'll come back to that, the latter, in a couple minutes. Now, I just thought I'd give you a fun little, when you're interpreting this, wise people build their houses on the rock and foolish people build their houses on the sand. Here is Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, who, a great picture of him, by the way. It's not a photo. The 4th century saint from North Africa is interpreting this part of the Sermon on the Mount in this part of his commentary. Such an one, therefore, is not afraid. And such a one is the person who builds a house on the rock. Such an one, therefore, is not afraid of any gloomy superstitions, for what else is understood by rain when it is put in the sense of anything bad, or of turnouts of men, which I think are compared to winds, or of the river of this life, as it were flowing over the earth in carnal lusts. So the water and the rain and the wind that come, Augustine is sure he knows what they are, and they're specific evil things. It's called allegorical interpretation, and it has persisted through most of the history of people reading the Bible. So he wanted to know more than just there were winds and rain. He wanted to find out what in his life, what in his congregation's life was meant by the winds and the rain. And he said, this is gloomy superstitions are the wind and the rain, people having superstition around them, or the turnouts. I don't exactly know what turnouts are, which are compared to the wind, or of the river of this life, as it were flowing over the earth in carnal lusts. So the things that buffet the house, Augustine is certain he knows, and he brings it in his commentary. For it is a man who is seduced by the prosperity that is broken down by the adversities arising from these 3 things, none of which is feared by him who has his house founded upon a rock. That is, who not only hears, but also does the Lord's commands. So he comes out in the same space, but he makes some very interesting interpretive moves. So I leave it to you, whether you want to find exactly what you think the rain is, what the wind is. Augustine leads the way, and have fun. But this gives you an example of how one era of Christian teachers would have brought this home to their people, not just with, weather comes, but with the specifics of what Jesus meant by the weather, right? All right. If that's the way that the sermon ends, with the house on the rock and the house on the sand, with anyone who hears these things and does them, actually does these things that I've been teaching you, is like the rock man. And anybody who doesn't do them is like the sandman. Both of them have heard, but the second group doesn't do them. If we're closing with that, let's take a look for a moment at the whole sermon as it lays out, because we've done it in a little bit of a granular way. We started with the Beatitudes through verse 16, the first week. We started with, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, and so on, and saw that in that teaching, Jesus has described the people to whom he's teaching against the odds. against the odds, he's saying, you're the people who are actually most blessed by God, which would have blown them away, I imagine. But he began with that and then told them an even more strange thing, which is the whole world depends on you. Salt was a preservative. Light was obviously a necessity in a world that didn't have electricity. The claim of Jesus that they are the salt of the earth, they are the light of the world, and that their lives are crucial to the well-being of all humanity. For these fishermen and tax collectors and peasants and day workers, again, would have been an enormous overturn of expectation. Having gathered them that way, having affirmed them, we saw him then in the second week go to the fulfilling of the law and the prophets. Do you remember that Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill, right? For not a letter or a stroke will pass away from these until all is completed, right? Therefore, let your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees and scribes, right? So he's laying out in 5:17 to 20, he lays out the relationship of his words to Moses. This is audacious as well. I'm not coming to abolish, but I'm going to fulfill Moses for you. I'm going to finish what Moses began. I'm going to bring it to its proper completion, right? That was heady stuff for a rabbi to say to a bunch of people on a hillside. Sorry. Then we went to the antitheses. You've heard that it was said, do not commit murder. I say, don't even get angry. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. I say, don't even lust. And we spent some time together in that first set of those, realizing that whereas rabbis put a behavioral hedge or fence around Torah, remember I gave you the example of my children. I never let them go off curbs when they were young, even though there was a lot of space in my little town. There was a lot of space between the curb and where the traffic went. We wouldn't even let them go off the curb because we didn't want it to come close for them, the danger to come close. Similarly, the rabbis had a principle that you put a hedge around Torah. If Sabbath rest is the command and you don't exactly know what work is, you err on the side of calling more things work rather than less, so you're sure not to violate. But their hedge was a behavioral one. Jesus, remember, put an attitudinal one in play, an interior life one. You remember that murder becomes anger and adultery becomes lust because, as we talked about, you can do a lot of things with your body when your mind and heart aren't in them, or you can be an aligned person who, I don't just avoid murder. I'm trying to live a better life than that. I'm trying to live in better connection with God than that. I don't want to seethe and fume all the time. I'm gonna stop short of murder and actually fill my life with things. You remember, so Jesus's hedge was an internal one, and that was striking to us, right? Because as we thought of our own lives together, and during the question and answer period, it came up, as we thought of our own lives, as we processed this, we realized there are a whole lot of difficult psychosocial things going on in our space, in our cultural space. There are things that are producing all kinds of neuroses and other problems. And so for Jesus to get to the gist of what's inside a person, the psychology of, the spirituality of, the interior life of, is a different move than the rabbinic quest to keep people from doing wrong things with their body, right? And so we saw another distinctive there between Jesus and the rabbis. We did that, the antitheses, for 2 sessions because it was worth drilling down on them. We got around to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. We got around to finally Jesus saying, if you love those who love you, don't even the Gentiles do that. And if you're kind to those who are kind to you, don't even the tax collectors do that. Um, but you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. A new standard, a different comparative. And so we have this life starting to be built, this presentation of a whole life lived that is from inside out instead of externally set. And that powers its way through chapter 5 and into chapter 6, where we talked about hypocrisy. You'll remember that hypocrisy is the name comes from the mask that ancient actors wore, two-facedness. And so we saw that people were giving alms because they wanted to be seen by people, and praying because they wanted to be seen by people, and fasting because they wanted to be seen by people. And Jesus said, that's not working for you. The attention of humans is not what you ultimately want. Connect with God in private, and the God who sees you will reward you. And he doesn't say with what. Is it eternal life, or is it you're going to have a fuller life? We don't know, but we kind of tried on maybe the authenticity that comes with praying to pray to God rather than praying for attention. It's worth a look. Giving for that reason, fasting, doing the things we do motivated to an audience of one is worth a look. So that was this first half of 6. In this good life that we're building, that's laid out in the antitheses, this deepening life, authenticity plays a huge part, and prayer as a center to that authenticity. And that's where we got the Lord's Prayer. In the second half of chapter 6, we went through Jesus's claim that single focus on the divine and trust in the divine lets us live with less worry and more delight, right? He says, consider the birds of the air, consider the lilies of the field. Don't store up for yourself treasure on earth, but store up for yourself treasure in heaven. Have the generous eye rather than the miserly eye. He continues to lay out this life, but it's not just here's a saying, there's a saying, here's a saying, there's a saying. We saw that it's strung through so that the red thread of the good whole life, the flourishing life, continues in all of these sections. And then in chapter 7, it culminated last couple weeks ago last week when we talked about the golden rule, right? When the golden rule becomes the culmination of not judging and the preview of a life lived on the narrow way, which isn't narrow-minded, it's narrow-focused, right? So we've been through all of that, and we gather tonight to see that all of that is what Jesus is saying. This is worth spending a life on, right? This is what I'm saying is worth doing and not just hearing. This deepened life, this engaged life, this God-focused life that somehow transforms the way that you are with people, that somehow makes you a different creature walking around in your community, right? So that you aren't condemning others. If you ever look at the little sliver in their eye, you're looking at it for their sake rather than your superiority. If you the continuation of this, the steady build of it was more striking to me this time than it ever has been. I've taught the Sermon on the Mount probably 50 times in one place or another. So it was fun to read it with you because I didn't get it before I read it with you. All right, so if that's the layout of the sermon, opening Captatio Benevolentiae, closing sort of this is worth a life, we finish, I'll get to this, we finish by noticing something that is true of Matthew's discourses. Sometime during our time here, when we were in our first week, and we saw Jesus go up on a mountain that was really a hill, I mentioned to you that there are 5 main discourses in Jesus's teaching in Matthew, and that parallels the 5 first books of the Old Testament, of our Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scripture, right? The Pentateuch. And so some have said Matthew purposely chose 5 so that the relationship to Moses would be struck as kind of subliminally as Jesus spoke. And it happens that 4 of those end as this one does in a parable. This is the first, and 24 to 27, and the wise person who builds a house on the rock and the foolish person who builds a house on the sand. That's the first parable that ends a discourse. The second is at the end of, that's a wrong reference, 13:5. I think it's 13. It's the end of the parables chapter, maybe even 13:52, but I don't remember the number. Anyway, that's a typo. It talks about master of the house, or a householder who brings from his storehouse treasures, and that's supposed to kind of close this parables chapter, which has been one treasure after another. In Matthew 18, we get a confrontation model from Jesus. If somebody sins against you, go and be made right with them. But even before that, become like a child, and a string of teaching that culminates with Peter asking, how many times do we forgive? And Peter says, do we do as many as 7, which was considered the outer limit? And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7, and tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. And if you haven't read that in a while, it's a beauty. But it's the way that it's the way that Jesus closes this conversation on forgiveness and closes that whole discourse. And then, of course, in Matthew 25, 2 chapters of discourse are summed in when the Son of Man comes in all his glory and all the angels with him, he will bring the nations before him and separate the sheep from the goats. The sheep he will put on his right, and the goats he will put on his left. And then it goes on to, you sheep, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, right? You know this parable, the sheep and the goats. That is the culmination of the last of the discourses. The only one that doesn't have it is 10:1 to 42, which is Jesus sending the disciples out and telling them how their lives will go out on the road in mission. But it's striking that he used parables to close. But here's something that a guy named W.D. Davies noticed in his commentary. I mentioned that some commentaries are worth reading for the way they treat 5 to 7. W.D. Davies, sorry about the picture. The guy did 50 years of amazing biblical scholarship, and the only picture I could find was like this low res thing. So if you want to go into the memorable eternity of admirers world, don't go into biblical studies, apparently, because nobody keeps a photo of you. Despite the significant parallels, he says, with the conclusions to the other major discourses, that is, the way they end in parables, 7:28 and 29 stands out as atypical, and 7:28 and 29 is where the narrator steps in. It says this is because it's the only conclusion to a discourse which doesn't carry the story forward. The others all immediately immerse the reader back into the narrative flow. So after the sheep and the goats, the next words just continue the narration. They don't look back. They just keep going. Same with all of these. So they immediately immerse the reader back into the narrative flow. Only after the Sermon on the Mount is there a pause in which to catch one's breath. This circumstance undoubtedly advertises the uniqueness of 5 to 7 for the evangelist work. Matthew's readers, and this is where I want you to especially beam in, Matthew's readers are expected to stop and ponder what has been said. They are to realize, however dimly, that the great sermon hides a multitude of profound ramifications, and that it is accordingly something to be returned to again and again. Treasures that we've picked up along the way, and Matthew's narrator gives us a moment to breathe and remember that when he says, The crowds were astonished because he spoke as one having authority and not as the scribes. It sort of gives us a pause point, and I'll quote it again. The great sermon hides a multitude of profound ramification, and it is accordingly something to be returned to again and again. That's what I commend to you. And we're going to hear a last word from someone who gave us one of the first words. She said it about the Beatitudes, but I think we're okay in applying it to the sermon as a whole. The simplest thing to do with them, perhaps, is to let these Beatitudes stand you on your head so that you cannot see the world again in the same way, but rather the way God sees it, turned upside down by the only one who really knows which way is up. Friends, I hope that at some level, this sermon has gotten into you in a Barbara Brown Taylor way, gotten into you by tilting things in comparison to where you've had them, or by reassuring you about the upside downness that you already had. I hope that the sermon has gotten into you, because if it stayed at an arm's length as something that was just interesting, that's okay. It's okay to know, I know now what the rabbis were doing in the 3rd century, and I know now what Deuteronomy says, and I know now it's okay to amass knowledge. Jesus preached it so that it would come into our lives and make them better and make our communities better. So I hope that at some level, that hope for you, that flourish for you, has landed even through these little eight times we've gotten together. Whatever the case, as W.D. Davies says, keep going back for the treasures. Keep going back for the treasures. Matthew says, there's a lot in here. Come on back.